Joe's a board-certified physician. He's worked in multiple environments, including hospitals, surgery centers, and in education. He is extremely unique in that he also served as a reserve police sergeant, including on a SWAT team where he served as a sniper. He has 4 martial arts black belts and serves in a leadership role on a search and rescue team today. And in general, he's just an all-in-all impressive dude. So, Joe, how's it going, man?
Well, thank you for that. I'm doing fine. How are you doing?
Not too bad. I'm really excited for this conversation. One of the things that we've been talking about with our parent channel, Everything HR, run by Manny. I'm sure most of our listeners know Manny. He was on the show with me last session. One of the things Manny and I have been talking about is this issue, especially in the world of business, where we see a lot of leaders that like to talk a lot, and they've got all these grand ideas and all these grand plans. But when it comes down to actually executing, actually getting the work done, they completely fall through. And part of the reason I wanted to have you on to talk to our listeners is because I know that your life and how you got to where you're at, you're a doer. You've got grand plans, you've got grand ideas, but you also get things done. So I just kind of want to hit on some of your experience and thoughts on that. Maybe you could start by just kind of explaining how you racked up a resume like we just went over, and what that looked like in your life.
Well, I don't really think of it as that impressive in that such that anybody can accomplish anything that anybody else does, as far as I'm concerned, if you are willing to commit to putting in the work and just saying to yourself that once you've made the decision that this is what I want, whether that, for me, it started out, I grew up in Detroit. You could say that I was bullied. I am not an impressive individual, 5'9", 160. My earliest memories are having somebody, an upperclassman, chase me with a baseball bat while I was walking to school. I didn't particularly enjoy that experience. So at the age of 10, I read in a comic book how a smaller person could defeat a larger one through these Oriental martial arts. Convinced my parents that they needed to take me to the local YMCA to learn judo. So that sort of started my martial arts odyssey. Went through a variety of martial arts. And when I was in high school, again, I did not come from a wealthy family. We were lower middle class. My parents were great people. They would have done anything for us. They just didn't have the money to put us through education. And in our family, their higher education wasn't in my extended family, not my particular family, but I had like 40 cousins, first cousins in the Detroit area. Higher education wasn't a priority. And when I decided that I thought that I wanted to go to medical school, I was ridiculed by my aunts and uncles that, no, you're not going to do that. I happened to have at that time a karate instructor who convinced us when I was like 16 or 17 that if you had the discipline to earn a black belt in karate, you had the discipline to do anything that you wanted in life. And I believed him. And so going through that experience, it taught me that if you, first of all, decide that what you want to do is worth it, that you have to be willing to make whatever sacrifice it is to achieve that goal. And in my case, for me, getting into medical school and getting through it was like, I have to get a piece of paper. And going through college, as most people who've gone through college and some people have gone through professional school, you have to put up with so much bullshit to try to get that piece of paper. Yeah. You say, this has nothing to do with ultimately I want to do. But the thing is, if you want that piece of paper, this is what you have to do. And you have to decide that's what you're going to do. So that's pretty much what I did. I went through medical school. Then after that, I decided I wanted to be specialized in emergency medicine because I thought that was where the action was. That's where I was always fascinated with the edge of life and death. What separates that? What can you do to put yourself into a position where you could be of help in those types of situations? So I started out in emergency medicine, did a residency in that. Last year, I was the chief resident, so forced to do research. I was doing research in brain resuscitation, which at that time, 40 years ago in the early 80s, the best research was being done by anesthesiologists. So I said, oh, what the heck, I'm young. I will also do a residency in that because I wanted to get to the point where I was capable of understanding and putting into practice some of that knowledge to extend our ability to help people who have undergone what was that called global ischemia, say a heart attack where not enough blood was going to a brain for a period of time. If you were fortunate enough to get that restarted, there was a phenomenon where the blood flow to the brain ultimately shut down. And even though the patient was still alive, they could become brain dead. And a lot of people were working on how to solve that problem. I worked with some of them, and then through a series of life events, through a failed marriage, I ultimately had to get a job after that. So yes, so after my anesthesia residency, when my wife said, I haven't seen you in 6 years, because you work 80 hours a week pretty much, and you have to do a lot of call away from home and nights away and so forth. So anyway, got through that, got a job. Always loved the Pacific Northwest. Had a relative that was in practice out in the Pacific Northwest, looked at that practice for anesthesia, went out there, started it. And along that time, I'd always been keeping up with my martial arts training. It was more difficult, but then when I finished and got a job, I was able to literally travel around the world and to follow that sort of passion. Got to train in Japan for an extended period of time twice, and remarried. When we had our first child, I knew that my wife was not going to let me travel around that way. So I managed to convince her, and she was gracious enough to say, for me to move back to the place where the person who I was training with, my teacher at that time, was in Dayton, Ohio. And so she moved back with me for a number of years. I got a job at a level 1 trauma center there. Got some really good business experience along the way, learning how to deal and negotiate with the CEO of the hospital in the benefit for our professional group of anesthesiologists. Learned a lot of lessons from him because I was very naive and inexperienced as far as business goes. And he sort of tooled me up, so to speak, and got to know some things on how to accomplish things there. And along the way, decided a real, as you're a kid, you sort of fancy yourself when you're in martial arts. Well, I'm a true warrior. Well, I was never in the military like you, so I really didn't do anything that was real. And became a firearms instructor and did that for a number of years. And then while I was doing that out in Washington State, somebody says, they have a reserve police program there that you go through the police academy on an extended time. Then you get out and, you have to go through the same probation and so forth, field training, and then you can get commissioned. So that was a very difficult thing to do because I had a full-time medical practice. I now had a family. I had partners that were, again, gracious enough to say, you're crazy, but we will cover you when you have to do this for nights on call and so forth. So they enabled me to finish that. As soon as I finished it, the head of the SWAT team says, you're a doctor, right? Yeah. He says, would you like to be on the SWAT team? I go, I have no idea what that even means. Again, never had any military experience. I was a martial artist and I was a shooting instructor, but being a police officer, that was all completely new to me. So they basically put me through the evaluation process, all that kind of stuff. And this was I finished that right around 9/11. So in September 11th came. October, I convinced the chief of police to let me become a sniper on the team, which was a kind of a big deal, being a reserve officer and a physician. They wanted me there for one thing. And I said, I do medicine all day long. If I can't do this other thing, there's no sense in me being here because it's not accomplishing what I wanted to do.
Right.
And I had already at that time gone to the Blackwater sniper course. So I'd already sort of on my own dime, self-educated me as much as I could there. And so they decided to send me to the CJTC course. Did that, was deployed for about a year on the team as a sniper, and then went to the advanced course, and then the instructors at CJTC, because they just would ask me off the cuff stuff. What would you do for this? And I started giving impromptu classes there. So they said, would you like to become an instructor? So I said, sure. So that started that episode, and I did that for 15 years. It was just a great ride, met some wonderful people, had some wonderful experiences, and I accomplished what I wanted to do in that context, which is something that you had already done way more than I ever did. But I wanted to know what I would do when somebody's trying to kill me.
Right.
And, you don't really normally get that experience, thankfully, in your normal life. But everybody at some point, a lot of guys want to know, well, what would happen when I'm really faced with that? So that, for good or for bad, I had those experiences, and I thought it was very helpful. And then I did 20 years doing that. And then the pandemic came. All the craziness that occurred there, I got kind of really disgusted with the state of medicine at that time. I probably would have been fired in the state of Washington because of refusing to go along with what it is that you were supposed to go along with, a completely unscientific method as to approaching this problem. In the beginning, nobody knew about the problem, so it was reasonable to try some measures to let's see what's going to happen. But when you start getting to the point where, if in a scientific context you do not allow contrasting opinions, and in fact you demonize and censor those opinions, then the progress of science is stopped. So at that point, luckily, I had enough, and I've had enough. So I quit then, retired, moved to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. My wife, who had not used to seeing me at the house at all, said, you have to find something to do. So that's when I got into search and rescue, and I did some classes for local SWAT teams, and I hooked up with former sniper instructors that I knew from back in the day, who had since started a company out here, taught some classes with him. And so now I have stuff to do, which is gratifying. But
pickleball is among them too. Pickleball is among them, folks.
Well, my wife, my wife, who's very social, she was kind of stymied by the restrictiveness and the fact that we went from a situation where we had a lot of social capital, knew all the doctors, all the politicians, all the cops. I had a problem, I would just pick up a phone, handle it. Moved to Coeur d'Alene, didn't know anybody. This was kind of frustrating for her, and so she came home one day and says, I signed us up for pickleball lessons. And what the heck's pickleball? So, I owed her a lot, so I learned how to do it. We started playing, and she took off, made lots of great friends, and so now she's self-sufficient as far as that goes. And so I had to really kind of find something on my own to do. But in regards to your question, how do you execute a plan? And along the way, when I was back in practice, along with my police career, I was also one of the managing partners of our professional corporation. We had 3 managing partners. We had about 12 physicians, 30-some nurse anesthetists, and 4 locations that we were providing services for in the city. So we had to negotiate contracts with third-party payers, with the hospital, with employees, and so forth. And one of the things that I found from other leaders that I admired is the first thing is that you have to have a plan that everybody has to buy into, that you sort of, like, you go to your partners, you go to your places, this is the way, these are the principles or the fundamentals upon which we want to build our practice. This, and this. And everybody has to say, okay, yes, that's the basic foundation upon which we're going to proceed. And you're always going to hit unexpected situations along the way, so you have to have the flexibility to change. But first, you have to have everybody's buying in. And then what my interpretation of being a good leader is that you had to, number one, provide a really good example. So you say to everybody else, this is what's important in our group, is to be this way, act this way, perform this way. Well, if you're not doing that, to me, it's not a very good role model. And as you know, people will model off the leadership. If they don't see the leadership doing it, they have no incentive to do it. And the second thing is that I always thought it was my job as a leader that my most important thing was to facilitate the success of everybody else. So that if I could find a way to make them successful, everybody's going to be successful. And so figuring that out, what it was that allowed them to be the best that they can, so to speak, in the context of whatever situation that you were in, that seemed to work the best. So, so far it seemed to work.
Yeah, and I want to hit on that point that you made about getting that initial buy-in and setting that foundation, because I've seen this a lot with business leaders, whether it's just team leaders or people that are leading an entire company, is they've got the right idea of where things need to go, but the action never happens because they never build that strong foundation. They never create the kind of standard that, hey, this is how we are going to do this. And it is a bit of an art, and you kind of spoke to that about how you still have to have that flexibility because things are going to come up, things are going to change. But there at least has to be that solid foundation. Everyone's got to be on the same page. Now, I guess my question for you would be, how would a leader go about getting that buy-in? Because especially now what we see in a lot of these businesses, a lot of these teams, is very different generations all having to work together. So for example, you might have a younger generation side that is like, hey, tech driven, everything needs to be tech. And then you've got that older generation. It's like, I'm going to retire before I ever even have to learn a thing about artificial intelligence or apps or whatever, And so they end up, okay, yes, we all want to grow. We all want to achieve maybe this goal, but they see very different ways of how to get there. And so what ends up happening is they all end up going different directions. And I'm wondering if maybe you can touch on, from your experience, how do you get that buy-in across the board and set that standard? Are you building those standards in a way that appeals to everyone? Are you using more of a kind of dictatorial, like, hey, I don't care, you're going to do this or you're out? What's kind of some of the techniques you've used and seen success with?
One of the things that I thought was important is that if you want somebody to accomplish something, and realizing that you're facilitating their abilities, which means that you don't want them to be limited by anything except their own creativity. So number one, you have to have clear goals as to what it is you want to accomplish. And then you have to have what are the principles, the fundamental principles as to why one direction works as opposed to another direction. And so if you educate or transmit the fundamental reasons behind why this particular path is important, and they can understand all the background principles behind why that should work, then as long as you're accomplishing the goal, it really doesn't matter the path, because somebody will come up with a unique path that you may have never thought of before, but it's going in the direction of the foundational principle, and it accomplishes the goal. That's great. As opposed to, and this is sort of a pet peeve of mine, is SOPs, standard operating procedures. Well, to me, the purpose of those is to prevent people from thinking. Because in this situation, I don't want you to think about it. I want you to just do this. And I'm not saying that there's never a place for those. Certainly there are places for those. But in a broader context, instead of teaching people a number of techniques of standard operating procedures that if A happens, you must do B. If C happens, you must do E. Instead, you say, okay, what are we trying to accomplish in this situation? And if you understand, well, it's affected by this principle, and that principle, well, maybe that B, standard operating procedure, is one way to get there. But if you're blocked because of circumstances, equipment, whatever is happening, you say, well, I can't do B now, and then that's the SOP. Right. What are you going to do? Most people will just shut down and say, well, we can't accomplish that. Instead of thinking, well, what is the purpose of this, and what is the ultimate goal? And now that I understand what it is we're trying to accomplish, and I understand all the factors that will affect whether that is accomplished or not, we could go about it this way, or we could go about it that way. And people left to themselves, if you have talented people, they're going to come up with ways of accomplishing those goals that you may never have heard of or thought of. And that's the beauty of a collaborative effort. And as a leader, it is your job to say, well, okay, I understand you're not doing it the way I told you to, but this works. This is in support of the basic principles to accomplish that given goal. And so you have to say, okay, well, we will do whatever it takes to facilitate that if it's shown to be successful in accomplishing that goal.
Right. Yeah. And I want to hit on two of the things you brought up into there. One was you talked about SOPs. It's funny. I come into consulting gigs sometimes and people expect me to talk about SOP, standard operating procedures, kind of step-by-step processes. And they're usually kind of taken back when I say, yeah, that's not what you need. You don't need that. And there, like you said, there is a place for it.
There is a place for it, but
there are definitely some roles, whether it's a technical skilled position or a manufacturing position where you kind of don't want them to think. You want them to just kind of be robotic and go through the steps. I like to, the example I like to use is Legos. I don't know if you remember Legos. Legos were a big toy for me as a kid growing up. But now when
Joe, remember our the contrasting age difference here.
yeah, exactly. Well, it's still you would know this. When I used to play with Legos as a kid, it would come in like a big blue bin, and it was just a bunch of pieces, and you would maybe have the little platform, and you would use your imagination to build things. So if my dad said, "Hey, Joe, go build a house," I knew he wanted a house, but I didn't have a step-by-step procedure. I just grabbed the pieces and made them work, and eventually he had a house. Well, I don't know if you've bought Legos recently, maybe for your grandchildren.
Not yet.
They're not there yet.
Yeah, because they're aspirate them right now. So it's
yeah. So the thing with the new Legos is it's not a big bucket of pieces. It's a specific design with a step-by-step process on what piece to put where. It is completely controlled. It is a SOP kind of style system. And, on a raising kids level, my thought is, holy smokes, why are you getting rid of creativity and letting them kind of, figure things out on their own? But I use that as a good example of there are some employees that if you were to hand them that step by step, you're going to be missing out on all of their creativity and their ideas and their brain power because now they're just following a manual. And so it is a balancing act. And I think, you talked about keeping things in the same general direction. The term I kind of like to use for it is having a robust framework. Like, hey, here's your left and right lateral limits. But within that, if you achieve the goal, great. And I don't really care how you get there as long as it's moral, legal, etc. One of the terms that I've used before and I really do believe in this, I like it a lot, is the concept of commander's intent. And my fellow veterans out there, active duty military, will understand this term because it's bred into any mission planning. And the idea of a commander's intent is very specifically going through a process to lay out a short synopsis of this is my intent for this mission or for this operation or this deployment. It might be like, okay, hey, we're getting deployed to a certain area in Afghanistan. Your commander's intent is to locate, identify, and clear out any enemy combatants within this area of operations. He doesn't tell me, okay, I want you to load your rifle before you go on patrol, and then make sure you have your GPS data all uploaded, make sure that you've got fresh batteries and all. He doesn't go into that. Commander's intent is this is the ultimate goal, and then he puts it on his leaders, his lower level leaders, to make the decisions that it takes in order to achieve that. And in fact, that's one of the reasons that the U.S. military has seen a lot more success with their leadership model. They believe in sort of that non-commissioned officer, that lower level leader, and really empowering them, as opposed to like a lot of communist regimes, specifically the Chinese military now. They are very, very top-down leadership. You don't do anything until the person above you tells you to do it, which is not very effective in the chaos of combat. Well, we see this in the private sector. There's tons of chaos, and when you overbuild some of those processes, what ends up happening is when people run into tiny little bumps, like you talked about, they freeze because they're like, I don't have the answer here. What do I do? So they're not
Mm-hmm.
problem solving. And then what happens is they lean on their managers, they lean on their supervisors, and they bring every little problem to their desk. Say, boss, what do I do with this? There's no step in the manual for it. What do I do? And then I have the boss complain to me as a consultant saying, my people can't problem solve. I go, well, you're not creating an environment for them to problem solve. You're
Yeah.
creating an environment of fear where they just don't want to step out of line. So I think your points on that are just absolutely spot on. It's a tough thing to do, I think, because a lot of people, especially like small business owners, there's a little bit of fear of giving up control. If I do let go and stop micromanaging, to use kind of a buzzword term,
Mm-hmm.
or overbuilding these frameworks, if I do that, everything's going to fall apart. And you hit on another thing that I really liked, is you said, if you've got the right people. So we kind of got to go backwards. If you are looking at your team and going, I can't trust them to problem solve, I can't trust them
Mm-hmm.
with that, what the heck did you do hiring them? Like, maybe we can get some new people in there.
And if you have that control, that obviously is the best way, is to put the types of people that you want into the types of roles that you have, and then educate them as far as to what are the basics for what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And if they're educated as much as possible as to, okay, these are the different ways, this is the principle of how this works, and you've come up with a problem and you don't have the SOP for it, hopefully they will figure out. An example of that is, you talk about search and rescue. That's what I'm doing to occupy my time now. And one of the things that when I got there is they had a medical program that I couldn't understand. We had a whole list of all these quote medical supplies I had to carry, and everybody had to carry in their pack. And I'm looking at it and I go, well, what is that for? What is that for? And I said, and I went to that. I says, who makes these decisions?
Yeah.
Well, nobody really. We just sort of evolved this over time. And so I thought, well, what is it that is most critical when you're hours away from definitive medical care and you have something bad happen? And so I came up with a whole program that I had a lot of resistance to, and it was having a particular focus. And the focus was on what we call PPPD, or potentially preventable pre-hospital death. So that there was two categories of victims: the person that we're searching for who was lost. Now, if he has several things that have happened to them by the time we find them, there's nothing we can do. Right. Then the other big category is ourselves, our people, ourselves, that are out there searching, and something happens, you're trying to build a fire, you can't get out of it because the weather's so bad that the helicopter can't come in to evacuate you. So you have to build a shelter, you have to build something. Right. And you use an axe, you try to do something, you open up an artery in your leg, and now you've got exsanguinating hemorrhage. Well, how do you learn how do you deal with that? Well, they weren't taught. And as you know, there's very simple principles as to how to deal with that. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, okay, I'm going to teach everybody how to handle the most common PPPD, as opposed to carrying a splint. We all had to carry a SAM splint. I go, well, what's the purpose of that? Well, if you break your forearm, is anybody going to die from a broken bone? No. Right. But yet we're filling up our pack with this, and we're filling up our training time on how to make a sling and a splint, but we don't even know how to stop someone who's choking. Right. An unintentional cause of death that most of us have at least heard about, a Heimlich maneuver, but how many people are actually trained in it? And then you have the bleeding, the most common cause of death from an injury. Well, let's all have tourniquets in our pack. So we once did a pack check at tourniquets. People were having those venous tourniquets that would put on you to draw blood. That's not going to stop an arterial bleed. Right. And where is it located? Oh, I've got one in my pack.
Down at the bottom, underneath my gummy worms.
So you chopped your leg, you've got an arterial bleed, and you fall back on your pack, and you got to stop the bleeding. Where are you going to go? So that was like the very first thing that we had to tell people, is you have to be able to access this. And the whole point was that, what is the most important thing? Stop the bleeding as quickly as possible. That's the principle. That's the guiding principle. How are different ways to do it? So we went over all different ways of doing that. Tourniquet, pack the wound, pressure dressing, all that kind of stuff. So that You may not have a committee of TC3 approved tourniquet, but you know what you have to do. Yeah, you have to put circumferential pressure around the limb so that the tissue will constrict the artery and prevent the loss of blood. So if you know that, what can I do to do that? Do I have a belt? Do I have a, what can I use to solve the problem? So initially people just want to, well, I just want to know what to do. Well, what you need to do is, what's the goal? Stop the bleeding. How to do that? Well, here's an SOP. You could use a tourniquet. If you don't have a tourniquet, what's the other things? Knowing that how you stop it is the circumferential pressure, you'll figure out a way of doing it if you understand the principles behind that. And that's just a very, very simple, small solution. And if you're going into business, when you have all sorts of other things where I need to get this widget to that person. Well, we don't have any widgets here. Well, what's the goal? To get the widget to that person as quickly as possible. Well, I know that a shipment of those widgets were just sent out. They haven't left yet, and they're going to someone that already has a good supply of widgets. Why don't we take those and give it to this guy that needs them right away, or whatever it is?
Right. Just
acknowledging that what is the ultimate solution to the problem? What are the different ways that we can solve that problem? So that kind of thinking, that kind of preparation by understanding the underlying principles that go into your business. What are the different ways of solving all these different things? I think goes a long way to success.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, that whether it's, you call it commander's intent or just building that underlying understanding, what it does is it allows those people to actually problem solve in the moment, as opposed to freezing up and then making mistakes. It allows for that growth as a company, as an organization wide. Even just to kind of use that same example you did with this widget that we got to send out, it lets them prioritize what they need to do. So, okay, I've got two customers. One's a small customer. There was a shipment scheduled to go out, but I know that they don't need it urgently. It's just kind of a regular thing. This other one's a big customer and they need it like now. And if I can close with them, then we're going to have a client that's going to be long lasting, extremely lucrative. Okay, I'm going to move my resources. And instead of having to go, well, but this is already in this pipeline and I can't put it over here, they can problem solve because they've been given that commander's intent or underlying foundational principles that allows them to make those decisions in a timely fashion. And I think that that's really what's so empowering about this model of leadership, is that it allows people to prioritize. I can't tell you how many leaders I've been in contact with that say, I don't know how to get my people to understand prioritizing things. And I said, well, how well have you laid out your priorities? Well, I know what they are. I go, okay, yeah. I know you know what they are, but do your people know what they are? And do they understand that knowing that can empower them to make decisions? And I think that sometimes that's a light bulb moment for some of these leaders. They go, oh yeah, I guess I should probably communicate what my priorities are. Otherwise I'm going to have people knocking on my door 18 times a day asking me what's my priority in this specific circumstance.
And the other thing that you mentioned is that it empowers people. And so that, as you know, on the battlefield or in business, if you have a situation where the person who theoretically is the only person that can make a decision to accomplish whatever that goal is, they're gone, they're sick, whatever, they're unavailable at the time. If you have built in the empowerment to people below them, someone else can step into the thing and says, okay, he's not here to sign that requisition or whatever, but I know that this has to be done. Do you have the trust in the people to empower them, someone who's not that particular manager, to say, no, this is what needs to be done. This is really going to further our bottom line if we can get this customer and satisfy them. So I'm going to take the risk. Are they going to be empowered to say, no, let's take it from that shipment and give it to that guy? And that requires, a lot of trust, and also requires that an adequacy of education as to the direction, the intent, and all that kind of stuff within the company as to what it is we're trying to accomplish here. And I think that is something that I've seen, is that, like you said, is that you don't empower people and they don't say, well, I think maybe this would be a good way to solve that, but I can't do that. And now everything stops and you can't go forward. And sometimes depending on the context, whether it's a tourniquet in the middle of the wilderness or you're trying to accomplish something with business, that could be fatal to that particular interaction.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, because then there's kind of always this caveat to this model. Obviously you've used this model in your leadership roles in the past. You understand the background of it. But one of the problems that does come up is what happens when you trust someone. You've provided the right level of education. You've given them that commander's intent, those foundational principles, and they make a mistake, and
Mm-hmm.
it costs you something. How do you, and how would you recommend someone handle that situation, keeping in mind that the goal is they need to fix the problem. They need to fix what led to the problem, but you also don't want to lose that culture of trust and that culture of empowering your people to make decisions and be creative. How do you handle those mistakes?
Well, I'm sure you've had a similar situation where after every mission or after every call out, you had an after action report. And so what you would do is you'd have an open, honest, and professional discussion about
Mm,
what went right in this situation, what went wrong in this situation, what are the tactics, equipment, or whatever that would have been beneficial to have in order to accomplish that goal. And so if everybody realizes after they've been through this once or twice that I am not going to be picked on because somebody hates me, that it's okay to make a mistake, but at the same time, you learn this is how we can correct the mistake. This is how we can say, oh, okay, everybody needs to have this particular piece of knowledge, or is it a piece of equipment that we're lacking? Is it a piece of software that would have been beneficial in this thing? So that when you go
mm,
over both your successes and your mistakes, and people get used to having that kind of discussion after episodes like that, hopefully, if you have the right people and you do it correctly in this open, honest, and professional manner, there'll always be a learning experience so that you can go forward with that as opposed to saying, you just screwed up, you're not going to get a second chance. And nobody really learns from that. Then you create this
mm,
hesitancy in people so that they are no longer empowered. And mistakes are going to happen. Depending
right,
upon the
right.
context of the situation, whether it's in the operating room, or it's on the battlefield, or it's in a business situation, the consequences may be different, but in all of those situations, people are human, they make mistakes, and you do whatever you can to try to prevent those. But going forward, you need to have some method of self correcting, of
Right.
realigning everybody's focus, training, and so forth, so that the next time it's going to go better, the next time it's going to go better, and you have this spiraling of competence that goes up.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you hit on this concept. Use the term after action report. Mostly of what I've used in my consulting side and from my background is the concept of debriefing, which I
Mm,
know with your background, with my background, we look and we go, well, yeah, of course we debrief. Of course we do after actions. I'm telling you right now, for most of the business world, the corporate world, they're not doing it. They're not even coming close to doing it. They're making mistakes. They're maybe hopefully at best correcting the mistake that was made with the individual who made it, but they're not disseminating that information. They're not, like you said, creating that upward spiral of improvements and success. And i I wish that I could somehow just implant in my mind what you and I, or plant in other people's minds what you and I already know, which is the power of debriefing, the power of after action reports. And I think that people look at it sometimes in just a very like mono-themed way. They say, okay, yeah, I guess I should debrief to, if something bad went wrong, I can fix it next time and other people won't make the same mistake. And yes, there's that element to it, but it also helps you in those debriefs. You build that culture. You build that
yeah,
culture of,
yeah,
hey, it's okay that I make mistakes. And not
yeah.
only is it okay, but when I make a mistake, I'm excited to tell my team about it so that they won't make it. And now I'm a hero to my team and that I prevented them from making mistakes. We have this phrase in the military, and I'm sure it's the same that you've experienced in law enforcement and other sides, is debriefs have to be nameless and rankless. And what that means is,
Yep.
everyone knows in the military, rank is very important. I mean, there is a long list of people that I would literally have to salute every time I walked past them. But when we went into the debrief room, you take your rank off, you forget your name, and you're just people that were on a mission discussing what happened. And it it's a delicate thing because some people don't know how to operate in that type of environment in a respectful way. And so there still has to be some level of control. But once you develop that culture, it's such a powerful tool because you're going to have people come up with suggestions and say, hey, I noticed that you made this mistake. I know from other past experience that you can do X, Y, Z, and it will prevent that mistake. And it's like not a, oh crap, I messed up. Not a, oh crap, you messed up. It's a, awesome. We just got better together and we just solved a problem in the future. And we're all excited about that. And you start that building that culture in those debrief sessions, which, like I said, unfortunately, most leaders in the private sector, they're just not doing it. They're not doing it at all. So I'm really glad you hit on that. So then let me ask you this question, how would you think going about is the best way to go about getting a group of people that doesn't understand debriefs, has never done debriefs, maybe is a little resistant to the idea of doing debriefs? How would you demonstrate for them the value of that step in the whole execution process?
Well, that's, I think, one of the key aspects of leadership. Because if you're a leader in whatever situation it is, and I've been on the SWAT team, and I've been in the emergency room where I've had groups of people, and you had this this horrible situation, things are happening, and afterwards, you have everybody come together, and we would have what are called M&M, or morbidity and mortality conference, which is the same thing as an after action report, where you'd get everybody, you'd get all the information, get all the players together, and then you would present that in front of the entire operating room or emergency room. In my case, when I was a resident, we had to do it in front of the whole department of whatever residency you were in. And that was a thing where it was useful in that you went through every little aspect of everything that happened, that this is what went wrong, this is what should have been happening, this is how we could have done it better. And depending upon the leadership of the person that was running it, if they were humble enough, if they were a good leader where they are trying to empower everybody below them, they will pretty much come up and find something that they could have improved on, just to say, hey, I should have done this. I should have made sure that you had this equipment at that time. And next time I will do my best to do that, just to give the signal that it's okay to make a mistake. And no matter where you are in the hierarchy of this organization, you're the doctor and this is the nurse. And the nurse told the doctor that, why didn't you think about this allergy? Yeah, I screwed up. Instead of saying, don't tell me what to do, I'm here and you're there. If you maintain that hierarchy in a leadership position, you're not going to get anywhere. You're just going to perpetuate this sort of aura or culture, as you said, the culture of fear and intimidation. So everybody's going to be defensive. Nobody's going to want to admit to doing anything wrong. And it's just going to be a terrible experience. If instead you say, listen, we're all here for this purpose, and that's to save lives or to be successful at business. We have our goal in mind. We're all here, no matter what our role in this process is to get there. And so we have to be open, honest, and professional is one thing that I always go back to. But it behooves the leaders to set the tone, to make sure that everyone else says, yeah, this is okay to do this. And, they're admitting they make mistakes. So it's okay if I admit that I made mistakes. Yes, and we have to have build that kind of a culture, as you say, a few times in order to get it self-perpetuating, so that as time goes on, again, you have this thing where you're going to spiral here, you're going to backslide, you're going to retool, you're going to reevaluate your processes, then you're going to get up to a higher level, and then at some point you're going to see a different problem, because now you're hopefully operating at a higher, different level, but that brings with it its own set of problems. And now you're going to have to recalibrate at that point, and you may backslide a little bit, but each time you go around, you're getting higher and higher and higher, more and more and more competent, as long as you have that basis of trust and that transparency all across the organization. And
Hmm.
it is difficult to do initially because you have to have, and it's upon the leadership to set that tone, to set that that stepping stone, if you will,
Yes,
to
absolutely.
get that going. So,
Absolutely. Yeah, no, again, I'm glad to hear a fellow evangelist on the idea of debriefing and after action reports, because man, I'm preaching this stuff. I'm on my soapbox with this stuff. It is such a powerful tool, and usually I just tell leaders, if you can just trust me and try it the way that I'm kind of explaining it, the way that Joe's explaining it now. It will make an incredible difference in your business, in your relationship with your team, improvement just on yourself. I, thanks to a mentor earlier in my life, I kind of developed the habit of, at the end of the day, even if it's just while I'm laying in bed, I kind of process my day and I identify, okay, this is one thing that I did really well. This is one thing I did really poorly. And, how can I fix that? How can I avoid that mistake in the future? Even down to the minutia of just, the way I interacted with someone. I said something that maybe wasn't the best way to interact with them. But one of the keys to that, and you kind of touched on it, and I just want to elaborate on it a little bit more, is that, okay, pointing out the mistake is step one. Creating the culture where people feel comfortable pointing out the mistakes is step one. But the next step is, okay, now what? Cool. We identified a mistake. We all feel comfortable talking about this mistake. But that can't be the end of the process. It's got to be, okay, now how do we fix this? What am I going to do differently going forward? And the way that it was taught to me by this mentor was, anytime there's a mistake, either in a debrief or in my little self debrief at the end of the day, is, okay, this is what I did. This is why it wasn't the best course of action. This is what I'm going to do in the future. And then make a promise. And even though we can't be 100% perfect, I mean, I'll say it in debriefs. I'll kind of do it like this, like, hey, I should have submitted this form on the certain date. I didn't submit the form on a certain date because I was doing a poor job of organizing my tasks. What I'm going to do in the future to prevent this problem is to start using a task manager on my computer, and I'll make sure to list dates and required dates with reminders on things I need to submit. It was my fault, and I promise this mistake will not happen again. Now, the real truth is, will the mistake happen again? It's possible, depending on the type of mistake. But just by making that promise out loud, you're also internalizing it. And your mind is internalizing that this is something important. So those are kind of the steps I like to go through when we're discussing mistakes that can be made. Another key point to the debrief that I think gets overlooked a lot of time by consultants and coaches and leadership is, we don't just debrief the bad. We also got to debrief the good. What went right? What did we do that led to this being successful? And it's important to debrief those in the same exact manner that you would a mistake, because we want to reinforce positive habits. We want to reinforce those positive actions. So that's just another, I just wanted to throw that in there, because sometimes people hear debriefing, and for all the reasons we don't debrief, a lot of it is ego, and you think it's all just negative talk, and you're worried about maybe creating a negative feeling in your team. Well, don't do that. Intentionally debrief the wins as well. It's definitely an important factor.
Yeah, and I think that we're talking about it in a context of an organization. And my experience is that in several different contexts of several different types of organizations, it's beneficial. But earlier you talked about, well, how is it that an individual can attempt to accomplish certain things? And so I really think that this whole idea, this concept of evaluation, what went right, what went wrong, is very important, even on an individual level. Like, as a person, I'll just give a personal example. When I'm trying to get into medical school, or I'm trying to get into a particular residency, or I'm trying to get better at a particular skill in the emergency room or in the operating room. And what I think is beneficial is that being honest with yourself to the point where you look at something and either it was successful or it wasn't. And you say, okay, that worked. That allowed me to accomplish what it was I wanted to accomplish. Or that didn't work. And instead of saying, oh, I'm just not cut out for this, I just can't do that. Instead of saying, well, what are my options that I could have done differently that perhaps is going to allow me to achieve success in this area? And so this honest debrief with even yourself, whether it's like I'm trying to attain a certain physical skill, and at my age I'm old and decrepit, and I just can't do what I want to do. But I think there's got to be a way of doing it if I could just figure out a way of going about it in a different way that allows me to accomplish the task that I want to do.
Right.
You're involved with this training that I'm doing as well with the martial arts stuff. And one of the things that we say there is that this is the chassis that you have. So you have to learn how to use it to its best effect. And that's true as your role within whatever organization you're in and whatever role that you're playing. You have certain capabilities that you don't even know that you have until you try to do that, until you meet failure doing it one way. And then you say, well, I'm not succeeding in this way. What are the other options that I could do that are integral to myself that will allow me to accomplish this? And so that's on a personal level. And then you just ramp it up, and this process works in every context that I've seen it, whether it's medicine, whether it's the police department, whether it's martial arts. At least in my experience, all those things, if you're honest with yourself and you look at your successes and failures, and in your failures, you don't look at it as that's a dead end. No, there's a way to accomplish that and make it into a success if I'm just creative enough and if I'm willing to do whatever it takes to go around and accomplish that goal. Right. And so the thing that it's scalable from the individual all the way up to a corporation, that concept, I believe, is scalable so that you can find success in all those different areas.
Yeah, I think without a doubt. And that's actually one of the things that I've run into before, doing on the consulting side is I'll talk to people, I'll put this information, they go, okay, great, Joe, that's awesome. If I ever need to jump out of a plane and attack a high value target on a small scale raid under night vision, then I'll go through these steps.
Yeah.
and that's what I try to get to them to understand is like, no, this is completely scalable. These concepts and these mindset shifts, yes, they do apply to that level of interaction, but they also apply just to the day-to-day stuff in your normal life. And sometimes that can be hard to pound it in people's head, but eventually when they try it, when they trust it, it works. And then it clicks and they get it. They go, oh, okay, I get this now. I kind of want to dive a little bit into, you mentioned some of the training that you and I have actually done together. And one of my favorite parts of that training is that it's no bullshit. It is just, it has the goal, which is to defend yourself in a life and death situation. And it kind of leaves out all the politically correct, that's not very nice stuff that sometimes gets thrown in with it. I'll tell you from my experience, especially in law enforcement, we would get this defensive tactics training, which for lack of a better term is versions of martial arts that are specific to the job of a law enforcement officer. And now, don't get me wrong, there are circumstances, especially as an agent of the government, that not every fight is a fight of life and death. Sometimes there's just fights of I need to get this person under control while delivering the least amount of physical damage to them, at least proportional levels, so that I can get them into custody. Okay, 100%, that's a different skill set. But there's also situations, especially when you carry a gun around all day long as a law enforcement officer, that it is life and death. And at that point, you need a new set of tools. But I saw in law enforcement, a lot of times instructors would shy away from the realities of being in a life and death fight. Even people that I know have been in those life and death fights, they still, for political correctness reasons or whatever you want to call it, would kind of shy away from that. And I see a parallel there for what we're doing in business today. In that, and when I say we, I mean the colloquial we, everybody. I see this all over. Is that they know what needs to be done. These leaders go, if you were to sit them down, get a couple of whiskeys in them, like the one I'm drinking now, they would tell you, this is what needs to happen. I know it's what needs to happen. And this person needs to go. And this person needs to get hired. And we need to change this initiative, whatever it might be. But then they get in front of a board meeting or something like that. They're like, well, we'd really like to target our synergy and make sure that everything's cross-functional. And they just start using buzzwords and they kind of beat around the bush. So I wonder if maybe you could talk about the importance of directness, honesty, and how that applies not only to things like martial arts, but also then translates in over to kind of the business world or just our everyday lives.
Well, business, as you know, can become a morass of misguided goals, unintended virtue signaling. It can be a situation where the activity of business no longer is about the business. It's about some external aura that you want to put out to the public. And when we've gotten away from really looking, if you look at the very successful business leaders throughout history, they are exactly like you were saying, is that what is it that I need to do to accomplish this goal? And naturally you have constraints, you have laws. But those laws aren't as restrictive as you think they are, because I remember a quote from Elon Musk. I read his autobiography, or his biography rather, and he says, listen, we're trying to do something that nobody's ever done before. So the only laws I want you to consider are the laws of physics. And that's what we're going to be constrained by, and not say, oh, well, it's just not done this way because most of the people in this business don't do it that way. Well, why not? Well, it's just not done. So you have to learn to be able to think outside the constraints, as long as it's within, you've got to have guardrails, no question about it. But within those guardrails, people are putting ever more narrow constraints upon themselves that aren't necessarily necessary. And so in the realm of business, you have to, what are the actual constraints and what are the perceived constraints? And are those perceived constraints something that I'm imposing upon myself that have nothing to do with the core mission of this business?
Right.
And it's the same thing with real life when we talk about, and I'll use the example of the medical program for, say, search and rescue. I outlined, these are the things that can kill you in the wilderness. One of them was anaphylaxis. 1,500 people die a year from an allergic reaction. 20% of those people had no idea that they were allergic to anything to begin with. So you're talking a fifth of the people that will say, oh, no, I'm not allergic to anything. And then they die from anaphylaxis. Right. And so there is a known way of treating that, and it involves injecting intramuscularly some epinephrine. And so they teach this to team leaders for Outward Bound and the National Outdoor Leadership School, and they have data going back to what happened in those cases going back 15 years. So we have the data, and we know that teaching these people with no medical background simply how to do an IM injection of 0.5 milligram of epinephrine in the situation saves lives. And yet, when I attempt to teach it, I have a subset of people that say, well, I'm not a medical doctor. I can't carry medicine. I can't do that. And really, all of the medical procedures that anybody can encounter in life that could kill them are less complicated and have less of a life or death judgment component than driving the car every day.
Right.
So if you're capable of driving the car, you're capable of learning and using the good enough judgment to do all these things. And yet, like you said, there's this huge reluctance to, I don't want to even think about those kinds of situations. Right. That's real life. That's reality. And I think that in several businesses, there's always this threat of, if you do that, somebody's going to sue you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Liability. Liability.
We have attorneys. We can hire an attorney. Those are threats that go back and forth, and nobody actually wants to go there. But if you threaten somebody with something, oftentimes there'll be this backing down. Right. And it usually doesn't even have to get to that point. It's just a matter of finding out what are the true guardrails that you can't go beyond versus the self-imposed routes that people are constraining themselves in. And that's a difficult lift for some people. Yeah, and the people that are successful aren't putting themselves in those constraining roles.
Exactly. And I like that you're talking about perceived constraints because
yes,
I would say that almost the majority of the constraints that I hear from people in the world of business are completely perceived. They're not
Yeah.
actual constraints. And it's funny because you'll talk to these people and they'll say, yeah, I want to build my company. I want it to be a $1 billion company someday. It's like, great, that's an awesome dream. But then they're like, oh, but I don't want to try to do this job because I'm not sure if I could do it. And I'm worried that if I fail, then it's going to, ruin my reputation. And I'm like, okay, well then you don't really want to be that $1 billion company, do you? It's at some point, and it's so basic. And then most of these people know this when you say it to them back, they go,
Yeah.
oh crap, you're right. But it's so basic that there is no reward without risk. And the higher the risk, probably the higher the reward.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that you can't be smart about it. And there is such thing as developing manageable growth in a business, because you can get kind of out ahead of your skis and then end up just tanking.
Absolutely. And the thing about life, though, is that whatever you do, there's going to be a risk to it.
Right.
If you do an action, there's a risk to it. If you don't do an action, there's a risk to it. And you just have to figure out and try to balance those risks and say what risks are worth taking and what risks aren't worth taking, because no matter what you do, you're taking a risk.
Right.
Whether you do or whether you don't. So by saying that, oh, I don't want to do that, well, the risk is you're not going to build $1 billion corporation.
Right.
Well, if I do this, I could build it. But if I, no matter what you do, there's going to be a risk. And you just have to acknowledge that and try to ameliorate those risks as best you can. And ironically, if you read the biographies of several very, very successful people like Richard Branagh, the guy that started Virgin Airlines. Everybody saw, what a risk taker. Now you read it, and he did everything possible to minimize every risk that he took in business.
Right.
But he did it in a very thoughtful way. And also he looked at what are the actual guardrails versus the self-imposed ones.
Right.
And he went to the actual ones and tried to manage every risk that he took along the way, and was very successful. And I think a lot of people just don't know how to manage the risk. Charles Lindbergh, another one that they say, oh, what a risk taker trying to fly. He figured out every aspect of that to say, what are the possible downsides?
Right.
How can I account for that risk and minimize it? So I think that people need to understand that aspect of it as they're going along in this journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And you use the exact right term, risk management. And we see businesses will tell me, oh, well, yeah, we've got a very good risk management program. And I said, okay, is it risk management though? Are you managing risk, or are you just risk aversion? You're just trying to get away from risk. Yeah. Those are two very different things. And you just pointed out some great examples. There are people that, yes, on the outside, there's tons of risk, but the reason they were able to take that risk is they did the research. They managed the risk. They planned for contingencies. Okay, if this goes wrong, I have a contingency plan.
Right.
And I think that's why some of this legwork in the background of maybe a business initiative or a business plan or whatever it might be in your teams that you're leading, is that people say, well, there's a lot of risk. If we don't do this, it fails, hurts our reputation, hurts our brand, whatever it might be. And you're absolutely right. People who say that say, you're absolutely right. But is it possible? Because you have to take risks to be successful. So let's analyze that risk. Let's really do the legwork beforehand that allows us to do something that on the outside people go, wow, that was really risky. But in your mind, you go, it actually wasn't that risky because I did the work beforehand that allowed me to know that no matter what comes, all these contingencies are ready to go. And I've really minimized my exposure to that risk. The risk doesn't go away, but how much you expose yourself to that risk is really within your power, within your hands. And so I like that we're talking about risk management as opposed to risk aversion, which is typically what I see these days is risk aversion.
And a great example of that is the aviation industry. I mean, it's inherently risky to be, 10,000 feet above the ground. It's just risky. And yet, as it proceeded, the aviation industry looked at all the different things that could cause a problem. You could have this problem, you could have that problem. Well, how do we negate that problem? Well, we do this. How do we negate that problem? We mitigate it this way. And now it's one of the safest forms of travel imaginable. Yeah. That was the model back when I was an anesthesia resident. That was like in the dinosaur ages back in the early 80s. We had the highest malpractice because it's an inherent, we bring people right to the edge of death so that the surgeon could try to kill them. And then we had to manage that risk. And so we looked at, well, what is it that could go wrong? And we used the aviation industry as a model. And all these people were putting their heads together and say, well, this is what could happen if they get too low in oxygen. This is a premonition that things are going to start to go bad. Mm-hmm. If their carbon dioxide goes too high or too low, that's a premonition that something would go bad. How do we know that? Well, we have to be able to monitor those things. So they set into place a standardized form of monitoring for every anesthetic so that we would have basically a pre-warning mechanism for all these different things that are going wrong in the body so that we could take steps to balance it out, to maintain homeostasis during that time. And now anesthesia, when you have an operation, for most people, the most dangerous part of their surgery is driving to the hospital. So it's like the aviation industry. You realize that there's inherently a risky process. Figure out all the different types of things that can go wrong and figure out a way to mitigate those risks. And it's been shown that you can be successful that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's I like that you brought up the example of the aviation industry, because right now it is so hot in the news. It's the hot topic of, planes are crashing and falling out of the sky everywhere. But if you actually look at the data, the actual information, even with these incidents that we've seen on the news, it's still a safer year this year than it was last year.
Yep.
So it's just, again, that's a whole nother example of just maybe we get so sucked into the media that it's all crap. But aviation is just absolutely incredibly safe if you look at the numbers, if you actually look at the facts. And like you said, it's the same when we talk about surgery, right? The most dangerous part is driving. And people drive every day and they don't even think about it. But sometimes I like to use it as an example because I go, okay, well, but you have kind of thought about it, right? And they're like, well, what do you mean? I go, well, you learned to drive at some point, right? Yeah, I learned, my dad taught me, or I went to driving school, or friends, whatever taught me. Okay. So you made sure that you had the education before you just started going out and flying around in this heavy chunk of metal, right? Oh yeah, I did. Okay. So that's risk management right there. Did you get car insurance? Oh yeah, I got car insurance. I go, okay, so you're doing some risk management for potential liability. So you kind of go through these steps. Did you wear your seatbelt? Yeah, I wore my seatbelt. Of course I wore my seatbelt. I go, that's risk management. So yes, you're doing an extremely dangerous thing. It's statistically pretty dangerous. Driving a car is extremely dangerous, but you did all these steps beforehand that allow you to manage that risk, to not be averse to it. Because if you were risk averse, you just would never get in a car. You'd say, well, I guess I'm not going to go to work today because, driving is so dangerous. But you've managed that risk. You've weighted against what the reward is. The reward is you can have a job and make money. And so you get in a car and drive. So people do risk management every single day. They just don't call it that or think about it that way. But if you can kind of put into their mind and show them, hey, you're already doing this, just apply it to your products now and your processes at work, it can be extremely successful. But again, I think it kind of comes back to building that culture. And I kind of want to circle back here a little bit, and we're coming up towards the end of our conversation, but we started off going over your experience, your background, and I was really fascinated with the concept of having a plan, deciding you want to do something, but then actually executing on it. And I'm curious, I kind of heard these arguments back and forth, and I don't have the answer on this one, but some will say, well, that's just the type of person he was. Or, well, he was kind of set up to be able to do this, or someone kind of forced him to do it. And so I just wanted to know from your background, not only in just the things that you've done in your life that led you to where you are, but also your expertise in martial arts, which are so heavy into the concept of discipline. How is that true? Is it just, are people just kind of born with it, with that drive, or can you, I guess, develop or instruct or implant into someone else that sense of drive and desire to actually execute on the plans and actions that they want to do?
That is a perennial question, is if I could inject someone with motivation, I mean, we would all be trillionaires, right?
Yeah.
How do you motivate someone to do anything? And I really don't know the answer to that. For myself, I certainly was not set up for success. I did not come from an academic background. I am physically not very imposing at all. Didn't have any role models from within my family to say, yeah, I'm going to be just like that person. Um, I think that to a certain extent, people have to be self-motivated in that they look at something and say, I want that. And after that, the extent that they'll go to achieve that, how does that work? I don't know. I really wish I did. And because I'm sure you've met people the same thing. And we talk about this in our training, how the basis of incapacitation, there's psychological incapacitation and physiologic. So you're in a fight with a guy, you punch him in the nose, he's got blood coming down his nose, and for him, the fight is over. So he's psychologically incapacitated. He didn't have the will to finish whatever it was. Next guy, you punch him in the nose, blood's coming out. Now it's on. Now he's just getting started because he's motivated for whatever reason, don't know why, he needs to continue with that. And so you may have looked, I know I looked at somebody and said, I want to be that.
Yeah.
I want that. And then you figure out, well, what does it take to get that piece of paper? What does it take to do that? And are you willing to do what it takes? How do you instill that in someone? I don't know. I really wish I did. Injecting motivation is difficult. I really don't know.
I wish there was that magic pill, but I know that this is something that I've had conversations with people about before. They say, hey, I think you're right, but I've got a team of people that, because of my circumstances, I can't get rid of them. So this is what I've got to work with, and they're just not driven people. And I kind of answer them the same way you do, going like, man, if I had the answer to that, I'd be a trillionaire because I'd be all over the place. And so I don't necessarily have that answer. However, I do think that, kind of just going back to some of the things we talked about in this conversation, the best you can really do is create an environment where they're able to have that drive, and maybe it encourages that drive. And there's several ways to do that. You kind of have to identify what people are motivated by. I mean, is this person motivated by status? Is this person motivated by money? Is this person motivated by spending most of his time at home and working less because he just wants to be at home instead of be at the office? And then based on those motivations, okay, maybe that's your tool to hopefully get to where you can instill some of that drive. I still don't think that that's necessarily maybe a perfect answer, but it's a step in that direction.
Another step.
Send it.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, send it.
But another aspect of that is that I haven't got that answer. You apparently don't. I don't know that anyone does have that answer of how we do motivate people, but we do know how to demotivate people, how to not motivate people. And if we can simply avoid those situations where we're turning off people's motivation, that's going to at least get us part of the way there, because there's a lot, like you said, there's a lot of different things that'll motivate people. But as long as we're not adversely motivating them, at least we're going to give them a better chance of being motivated. And that comes from good leadership, having a clear idea of goals, and all those things that good leadership will do, fundamental ideas of the direction we're going. That is going to foster some motivation as opposed to turning it off. So if we just simply get rid of the negative, we're going to be farther ahead.
Yeah, I love that. That is it's like a Sun Tzu way of looking at this, where I know what my enemy is. My enemy is demotivation. I'm going to what would be the best way to demotivate this person? Okay, now let's flip that on its head. I really like that. I think that's an extremely powerful tool. I will say that I also do believe highly in that everybody's different. And that's why, even when I've come into these consulting gigs, is sometimes people want me to just give them that magic pill. They're like, what's the answer? Tell me exactly what to do. And I have to be honest with them and say, I don't have the exact answer because you're the one who's with your people all day, every day. I'm not. I fly in for a couple hours, deliver some training, and then I go home. You're the one that's in it. So you got to take maybe some of these tools and concepts that I talk about that you're talking about here today, Joe, and people can take those tools and concepts, but they have to mold it to their team, to their mission, to their style of leadership, because I think there are different styles of leadership. At the end of the day, that's the burden of leadership is, we're going to find tools, but you have to figure out how to mold it to your team.
Yeah. So if there's any secret, it's that let's not kill it in its birth of the motivation. Yeah. And maybe just by not killing it, we're going to blossom something out of it, as opposed to say, well, the only thing I'm concerned about is learning how to motivate. Nobody knows how to do that. But as long as I don't prevent it, hopefully something will blossom from that.
Yeah,
with good leadership and so forth.
And one of the models that I've used in the past to just kind of explain some of that is like growing a garden. Now, a lot of people chuckle a little bit when they see like Marines standing in front of them talking about gardening, but I like gardening, so you can shut up. but think about when you're trying to grow something. You're trying to grow something, your own food, sustenance for your family when the apocalypse comes, and I'm living up on my hill with my ammunition and water purification kits and whatnot, right? But at a certain point, growing your own food, you don't sit there and like beat the carrot into submission until it grows, right? What you do is you create an environment in which it has the potential for growth.
Exactly.
And one of the cool keys to that environment is that if you really get to know a lot about plants and stuff like that, again, I've barely scratched the surface, but I have had the opportunity to talk to people who really understand horticulture. And sometimes one of the keys to growth is adversity. They need certain things to be difficult for them in order for them to grow. Sometimes for example, you can overwater plants. Mm-hmm. You can give them too much water and then they don't grow to their full potential. They need some of that sort of drought conditions, certain plants especially, and it encourages them to grow even more. So just because sometimes people hear when I talk about fostering that environment for your people to grow, they think it sounds kind of like pansy-wansy and like I want to hold their hand and kiss them on the forehead and tell them what a good little boy they are. But that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that environment involves very strategically and at the right time putting on a little pressure, a little bit of challenge, a little bit of difficulty. But then when you can see they're about ready to stop, okay, now I'm going to pour some water on that plant. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different. And to me, that's a really good way to just kind of illustrate that art that every leader has to have when it comes to creating environments where your people are, like you've said earlier, empowered to grow and be successful and take risks, manage the risks that will allow it to really expand. And in turn, another point that you made very early on in our conversation is when you empower other people to be successful, it's not altruistic. At the end of the day, them being successful is going to lead to my success.
Absolutely. It's very selfish.
Yeah. And it's funny. I talked last episode with Manny about this individual I was doing some consulting for, and he was a sales manager, and their commission structure was just a mess. It didn't make any sense, and it wasn't very motivating at all for his people. And as we know, most salespeople are highly motivated by money, which is why they're good at what they do. So I gave him some advice. I was like, hey, here's how you need to restructure. And he's looking at it and he's going, And I can tell he's already just like getting a little critical of it. I said, well, what do you see that you don't like? He said, well, I'm kind of running numbers in my head. And he's a smart guy. He was a very smart guy. So I'm running numbers in my head. And I think with this structure, some of my salespeople could end up making more money than me. And I did exactly what you did. I kind of cocked that. I'm like, yeah, man, that's the point. And he goes, well, I mean, and he tried to play it off. He's like, well, I'm not that worried about, but at the same time, I probably shouldn't have people making more money than me. And I go, dude, if you want to be a successful sales manager, your goal should be for them to make more money. And then I said exactly what we're saying here. And it's not altruistic because guess what? When your people start making more money, you can go to your boss and say, maybe look what I did more.
Yeah.
And you're going to get a big fat bonus at the end of the year. So that concept of empowering other people. And there should probably be at least some element of that empowering, that if you're a good person, it's because you want to see people you care about succeed. there should at least be a portion of it that's that.
Mm-hmm.
But even if there's not, even if you're just a totally narcissistic, selfish person, if you want to be more successful as a leader, you got to empower your people and you got to get them to be successful. And that should be the focus.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, I tell you, I think we're coming up on closing out. I just want to thank you for being here, Joe. It's been a great conversation. Hopefully we'll have you on again down the road. I want to give a quick shout out to our parent channel, Everything HR, run by Manny. We talked to Manny last episode. He's on there every single time. Great resource that kind of points you in the right directions for whether you're at any level of HR professional, whether you're managing, you're a director, whether you're a chief people officer. There's some information in there that's great for you. And also, I just want to thank you for listening to Mission Critical. Again, we're all about delivering you the essential tools for leadership and human management. That is what this is all about, is managing humans. Sometimes we say management and we just think process, SOPs like Joe was talking about earlier. At the end of the day, it's managing people, and you have to understand people in order to manage them. And in order to understand people, you first got to understand yourself. We've got some great episodes in the pipe. I've got a panel of sports, high school sports coaches that are going to come on and kind of go into some of the details of the challenges of bringing on and hiring this younger generation into the workforce. Because believe me, folks, they talk different, they think different, they view things differently. And you can sit back in the corner and say, darn kids these days. At the end of the day, this is going to be your workforce, and you're going to have to learn how to properly manage them. So stay tuned for that episode coming up. We've also got some great guests later in this quarter. Thank you again for listening to Mission Critical. Joe, thank you. Everyone, have a wonderful time.
All righty.